So you're Shell in the 1990s, one of the world's biggest oil companies. You've been exploiting Nigeria's oil reserves for a few decades now, without caring too much about the environmental damages you've been causing. But now you're facing a problem. The people of the Ogoni land, a region in southeast Nigeria with large oil reserves, have had enough of your business, and you can't blame them. Oil spills and decades of waste dumping have polluted their water supplies. People are forced to drink cancer-causing substances with every sip of water. Plus, farming and fishing have become close to impossible. Many men can no longer feed their families. So now that you've destroyed their lands, made them sick, and killed their source of income, a few stubborn protesters want you out of their country. That's not good, because if you lose control of Nigeria, you lose out on billions in oil. So what do? You call your best friend the Nigerian government. See, during this time, Shell was so powerful in Nigeria that they had the entire military at their beck and call. Yes, a private multinational corporation had an entire country's military in their pockets. Which is kind of like if Amazon had the US military at their beck and call. And Shell wasted no time putting the Nigerian military to use. You tell the military to strike the protesters with force, no matter the cost. The results? Widespread bloodshed. A full-blown assault on protesters that could only be described by onlookers as, quotes, like an invading army that had vowed to take the last drop of the enemy's blood. 80 Nigerians dead. Almost 600 homes burnt down, all in the name of protecting Shell's bottom line in Nigeria. But Shell's fight against this opposition was far from over, and they were gonna keep fighting as dirty as possible. This is the story of how one oil giant sucked a country dry for all it's got, while leaving a wake of death, devastation, and misery in its path. This is the story of how Shell stole Nigeria. In 1833, a businessman named Marcus Samuel decided to expand his London antique shop. Seashells were all the rage back then, so he started to import and sell them from the Far East. When Marcus Samuel died, his two sons Marcus Jr. and Samuel took over. During a trip to the Caucasus in 1890, the region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea connecting Europe and Asia, the two brothers came to realize the huge potential of the oil markets, so they wasted no time and started to restructure their business. They renamed it to the Shell Transport and Trading Company due to their father's passion for seashells.
The Rothschilds were active in the business. They built up a considerable position. They had a problem though. They couldn't sufficiently market their oil. They needed markets, and they were interested in markets in particular in the Far East, where their potential was very great. They knew a person who traded in the Far East, who he thought had the vision and the guts and the drive to work something out, and that was Marcus Samuel. Having met the Rothschilds, Marcus Samuel recognized that he had a fantastic opportunity to create a new global oil trading company. He also knew that it was going to be very risky and dangerous because he was going against the most powerful international company, John D. Rockefeller Standard Oil. And he knew that Standard Oil would do everything it could to frustrate and prevent this new venture from getting off the ground.
By 1907, the company merged with the Royal Dutch Petroleum Company, and Royal Dutch Shell was born. They quickly became known as Shell.
The finances of the company had become quite dilapidated, and finally one of Samuel's key employees told him that the only hope for survival of this company he'd created and that he really loved was to merge it with Detterding's Royal Dutch.
Shell's main goal was to compete with John D. Rockefeller's oil company, Standard Oil.
Rockefeller was pretty well everywhere. In fact, I suppose the nearest comparison I can think of would perhaps be IBM in the 1960s or 50s, a huge share of the world market. And therefore, if a newcomer was about to start in one particular market, he was able to squeeze them out by just slashing the prices in that one market.
Challenging Rockefeller's oil empire was quite ambitious, but thanks to the huge demand for gas and oil, Shell had many opportunities to rise to the top.
What is your petrol?
Super Shell with ICA, Super Shell with ICA, gives more go for what you pay. Family motorists in the know, stop for Super Shell and go.
During the First World War, Shell was the main fuel supplier for the British Army and the only supplier of aviation fuel.
And there's a rather nice little quotation in the front of it, saying, without toluol, without petrol and oil fuel supplied by the Shell organization, the Allies could not have beaten the Germans.
What the First World War established was the strategic significance of oil, that oil, access to oil, possession of oil, the ability to use oil would be a critical element in national power. And that was one of the lasting lessons of the First World War.
Shortly after the First World War, Shell accomplished their goal. It passed Standard Oil and became the world's largest oil company. But Shell was far from done. It was time to keep expanding. But the problem with being an oil company is that you can't just produce more products out of thin air like you would if you manufacture cars, for example. No, you actually have to go out and find more oil reserves. The problem with that is that most countries are protective of their oil reserves because they know just how valuable it is. That's why you need to find oil-rich countries that are also poor. That way, even if they understood how valuable their oil was, they wouldn't have the skills or infrastructure to extract it. So they have to turn to someone like you. But on top of being poor, we also need one more ingredient, one more qualification for a country to have for us to want to take advantage of them: corruption. That way, even if the people of the country don't want to work with us, we can just bribe our way in, abuse the people of the country, and still bribe our way out of trouble. Everything becomes easier when the government is corrupt. That's why by the end of the 1950s, Shell set its eyes on Nigeria, and it would turn into a true nightmare for its people. In Nigeria, you wasted no time getting to work. You form a partnership with Nigeria's government to make sure that no one comes between you and your billion-dollar profits. When wellheads explode and it pollutes the people's water supply, you just shrug your shoulders and say it's not your fault. You don't care if people's main source of drinking water has been poisoned. You don't care that farmers have to stay away from their own farms out of fear of igniting a fire. Or the few brave farmers who dare to return to their home have to literally swim through a sea of crude oil. Due to the polluted water, Nigeria's people were facing severe health risks. Families were drinking cancer-causing substances with every sip of water. It also had a devastating effect on farming and fishing.
The source of income is killed off.
All of this pain and suffering led to protests against Shell. They wanted Shell out. They wanted these foreigners to stop taking their wealth and destroying their home, but you were having none of it. With Nigeria's government in your pockets, you allegedly go to them and whisper in their ears, if you want us to keep lining your pockets, you better get the military to take care of those pesky protesters. And in an instant, these protesters' fates were sealed. Shell, a private multinational corporation, now had an entire standing army at its beck and call, and the result was brutal. Guns went off, grenades were thrown, as the military launched a full-blown assault against all those protesters. In the end, 80 people were killed and almost 600 homes were burned to the ground. Witnesses saw the police rushing in, quote, like an invading army that vowed to take the last drop of the enemy's blood, end quotes. Shell now had a winning formula. Whenever there was a protest, Nigeria's military would rush in to save the day. In April 1993, the military wounded 11 people who were protesting against a new pipeline. A few days later, troops opened fire on protesters at a village, killing one man. But Shell soon ran into another problem. The Nigerian military was poorly equipped to defend your oil operation. So you even allegedly provided the Nigerian military with boats, buses, and helicopters. And of course, they also get a nice paycheck for their violent services. After Nigeria's task force shot at thousands of protesters outside of Shell's compound, you feel nothing but gratitude. So you pay the responsible general and his men a nice fee, and you tell them that you're looking forward to collaborating with them more in the future.
The military may rape the women, torture you, they loot our properties, and they were burning houses.
But Shell's greatest enemy was still out there. Ken Saro-Wiwa was a Nigerian writer and environmental activist. He was also the president of the MOSOP, the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People. In 1993, he led a non-violent protest against the pollution of the Ogoni land's land and waters.
We are going to demand our rights peacefully, non-violently, and we shall win.
Remember, the Ogoni land is a region in southeast Nigeria with large oil reserves. But that protest didn't go as planned, because in the following weeks, Shell continued to expand its operations in the Ogoni land, devastating more communities in the process, all with the blessing of Nigeria's governments. In the eyes of Shell, this activist Ken Saro-Wiwa proved to be a nuisance. He was the most stubborn protester you faced so far, an idealist who would stop at nothing to get Shell out of Nigeria. Saro-Wiwa and his MOSOP group started to sabotage Shell's infrastructure and even intimidated Shell's workers. And his strategy worked. Shell had to pause its operations in the Ogoni land for a good amount of time, and every single day the operations were paused, you were losing out on tons of profits. All because of one man. Shell had found a worthy opponent, and it needed to teach this guy a lesson. And here's the thing, when you're faced with a worthy opponent and you have the opportunity to strike, you cannot hold back, you cannot show any mercy. Why? Because if you only crush your enemy partially, they'll eventually recover and seek revenge. That's why the only way to win is to crush your enemy totally. We're talking absolute brutality to make sure that they can never get back up. So you allegedly sit down with Nigeria's governments and map out a plan to take down Saro-Wiwa and his MOSOP group once and for all. Only 3 weeks later, you see your opening. 4 of the local chiefs were brutally murdered by a mob of angry youth. This was the perfect opportunity to pin those murders on your enemy. Saro-Wiwa wasn't in the area that day, but that doesn't matter. You allegedly make sure that he's arrested for enticing those murders, allegedly pay off a few locals to give false testimonies at the trial, and boom. Saro-Wiwa, Shell's #1 enemy, suffered in jail for over a year before they found him and 8 other MOSOP leaders guilty. On November 10, 1995, Saro-Wiwa and the rest of the Ogoni 9 were hanged by the military. The message to the locals was clear: get in the way of Shell's profits, and this would be your fates.
So the prison one, they called me, oh, your husband said you have to pick up his stuff. So I took it and I was just screaming, crying. Is this true that you guys already killed my husband? He's gone? And some of them were just telling me the story. What happened before my husband died? They say your husband,
I never imagined this, and I never imagined that even 20 years later the thing would still be so painful as if it happened yesterday.
For almost 3 decades, the widows of the Ogoni 9 have been fighting for justice. But since they couldn't win a lawsuit against Shell in Nigeria because, well, the government was the main accomplice, they had to look for justice in other countries.
oh my God, they have very tight relationship. When you see government, you see Shell.
The prosecution alleged that Baron M. Kiobel whispered into the ears of some of the attackers, and from that they inferred that he'd actually directed the killings.
In 2017, the widows launched a court case against Shell in the Netherlands. The court in The Hague heard testimony from 5 witnesses, and some even admitted that they had been paid by Shell to give false testimony, which led to the execution of the Ogoni 9. But the judges decided that the evidence was just not enough to hold Shell accountable. In the end, all Shell had to say was a very generic statement written by their PR department. In 2009, Shell paid a measly $15.5 million to some of the activist families, including Saro-Wiwa's family. Compared to Shell's profits of more than $500 billion since 1990, they probably weren't too worried about this fine. Amnesty, a human rights group, studied thousands of Shell's internal documents and found that Shell, quote, encouraged the Nigerian military to deal with the community protests even when it knew the horrors it would lead to: unlawful killings, rape, torture, and the burning of villages, end quotes.
The internal Shell records that we've been through show that executives encouraged the Nigerian government and military to deal with these Ogoni protests. That executives understood very well the risks of inviting the Nigerian army to guard its contractors who were laying this pipeline. But despite this, they still insisted that the operations go ahead.
They were really buying the special forces for future assignments and to make sure that they would keep doing their favors. And they were really not sending a signal that killing people is out of the order.
To this day, Shell denies any involvement in the executions.
If you see something, say something.